from EAP, Life Work Connections EAP, and we're here today to talk about bridging generational gaps. I'm also a doctoral student over at Warner, so I've been in school forever. With that being said, I've also listened to a lot of lectures. And I know from personal experience when I'm just listening to a lecture and it's not very interactive or I'm not asking questions, I have a tendency to have my mind wander off and do things it's not supposed to be doing. So to get this started, what I want you guys to do is I want you to connect with someone around you. Even if you have to turn around and talk, we'll take like about 5 minutes. And I want you to find hopefully somebody that you don't know, but talk about what was hot when you were in high school. Okay? So take 5 minutes and just connect with somebody and start talking about sharing experience about, and here's a list of the things as to what was hot when you were in high school. Does everybody have a chance to share? Does anybody want to share what they found? Were there differences or were there commonalities? What did you guys find out?
So we found out we're just like a little shifted. A little shifted.
shifted.
Yeah, I think
Right.
Decade apart.
Yeah.
Decade apart.
So
Different experiences. Anybody else find some big differences? Did anybody kind of realize when you start talking about this stuff, like thinking back to your high school days, like what was going on historically, also fashion-wise in that time era, how that kind of shaped some of your values, your work ethic, things like that? Start kind of connecting with any of that? Okay, did you have your fingers?
I was just going to say, I think find common ground when you have this conversation.
Right.
You know, maybe something I related to with my partner was something that I knew about more because that was my kids. The things my kids were doing.
Right. And you bring up kind of an interesting point with kids, because one thing that I've noticed from like the time that I reflect back, because I have a 12 to 14-year-old right now. So when I reflect back, into being in middle school and what was going on then to kids nowadays, I mean, there's a huge difference, especially with just technology. So I noticed in just that generational gap that there's a big difference in the way that they're experiencing things and what's going on in the political environment, all things like that. So definitely big changes, definitely some common ground, but some big changes. So when we think about different generations, there's different information depending on where you look, that there's either 4 or kind of 5 generations right now currently in the workplace. We've got the silent generation, which is 1925 to 42, the baby boomers, 1943 to 60, the Generation X, 1961 to 1981, and the millennial generation, 1982 to 2005. We also have the younger generation after the millennials that's starting to come in. They're kind of an intern position, so it's something that's constantly changing. It doesn't stay, obviously, and get to the point where the silent generations are almost out of the workplace. In probably another 10 years or so, they'll all be out. So it's something that's constantly in flux, and because of that, it constantly changes the environment of the workplace as well. So this is another graph kind of indicating that there's 5 generations in the workplace. And then you've got generation 2020, which is actually my 14-year-old's generation, which kind of scares me a little bit. But, so this is just like a different idea, and it kind of shows you with the colors, like in 2020 where the millennials are, in 2005 where they were. So you get the idea of how this is constantly in flow. It's constantly shifting, and because of that, it's constantly impacting the workplace environment. And this is just focusing on the different age groups, and you think about other diversity issues, coming on, you've got gender diversity, you've got social class diversity, you've got different cultures, so all in all, you've got a whole bunch of different elements that are coming into the workplace. So focusing on 4 generations at work, each group has its own distinct characteristic, values, and attitudes towards work based on its generation's life experiences. I was very fortunate when I was growing up because both of my parents were working. So I spent a lot of time with my grandparents on either side. And they would always tell me their stories about, how they grew up and, their generation going through the Depression. Does anybody have grandparents that were from the Depression era? What did you notice about them?
Frugal.
Very frugal.
Oh, yeah. Like my grandmother had a ball of tinfoil underneath the kitchen sink that was like this big because she didn't want to throw any of it out. And then, it was always buying canned food on sale and like stocking it. When my dad's parents actually passed away, sadly, but they were good age. They were in their 90s, so they lived a good long life. Their entire basement of their house was like this huge storage bin. And one of my grandparents' favorite stories were they did something that was kind of unconventional in their age because they, in their era, they dated each other for 3 weeks before they got married. They started dating and then they got married 3 weeks later. But to their credit, they were married for 67 years, so that's pretty amazing. But they love to tell this story. My grandfather was stationed out of Texas. So they got married in New York and they drove, and this was during the wartime, they drove across country in this car where there was a ration on tires. So every time, it's like every 100 miles or so, they blew out a tire. So this entire honeymoon trip, was the theme of it. They were changing tires all the time because the tires were all bald because they didn't have new tires. So that was always a big thing for them as well too, is they always made sure, and part of their care for us, tires were a big thing. When we started driving, we always had new tires on our car. That's what we would get for Christmas. And when they did pass away in their basement, they had a stockpile of tires in the basement because you never know when that was going to happen again. So you see how some of these kind of life experiences shape people, and I know for the Depression era, that was really hard for a lot of people, and that's where the whole frugality, the work ethic. I know when I was in college and I decided to take a gap year for myself. I think both of my both sets of my grandparents just had a coronary because you just didn't do that back then. So you can kind of see where some of these values and differences they carry through. They're part of people's personality, but as things change, sometimes it's hard to flex with those. So when you look at the silence, these were like grandparents. Values were shaped by the Great Depression, World War II, and the post-war boom years. They're considered among the most loyal workers, highly dedicated, and most risk adverse. Silence possesses a strong commitment to teamwork and collaboration and a high regard for developing interpersonal communication skills. These are the people that want to talk to you face to face. They don't want to text. They don't want to use cell phones. They don't want to do any of that. They now consist of the most affluent elderly population in U.S. history due to their willingness to conserve and save after recovering from the financial impact of the post-war era. Again, the frugality, right? Because they went through some hard times, so they didn't ever want to be in that position again. So you can kind of see the newspaper thing, millions lost, stocks crash. What an impact that must have had. So in this presentation, I think that being a therapist for a long time, I know that human nature has a tendency that we're a little tilted to the negative side. It's pretty different. Notice that it's really easy to be negative or judgmental about people, kind of a little harder to be positive. Okay? So in this presentation, I really focused on the strengths of the different groups because I think when we focus more on strengths, it puts us in more of an action phase. Also perceiving positive aspects of people, and because everybody has them, everybody has their good and their bad. But when you focus on strengths, especially in working with diversity and different generations, then you're kind of looking at the workplace environment. Okay, well, this is, if you've got like a technological issue, some of the younger generations really excel at this stuff, right? So that's one of their strengths. So that's some position that you might want to have somebody tackle, or somebody that's more face-to-face person, work ethic. You would probably want somebody that's more traditional based. So just kind of something to kind of keep in, and that's why we're focusing on the strengths here. So the strengths of the silence, I know this was a huge thing with my grandparents, the whole waste not, want not. That's why we got the huge bottle of tinfoil underneath the kitchen sink. Always preparing. I know both of my grandmothers were always canning and gardening and doing all this great stuff, which actually now it seems like it's kind of gone through revitalization. People are starting to do that now. Strive for financial security, conformity, conservatism, traditional family values, demand quality, simplicity, patriotic, patience, team players, and understands an ability to sacrifice for the common good. So the baby boomers were shaped primarily by a rise in civil rights activism, Vietnam, and inflation. They are first generation to actively declare a higher priority for work over personal life. I thought that statement was interesting because when I think of baby boomers, I kind of think of this picture underneath, the free love, not work, right? Kind of bucking conformity. But as they got older and had families, this became very important to work. So boomers generally distrust authority and large systems. They are more optimistic and open to change than the prior generation. Responsible for the new generation with its pursuit of personal gratification, which often shows up as a sense of entitlement in today's workforce. What is something that you've noticed that every generation says about the younger generation coming in?
They're selfish.
Selfish.
They feel entitled.
they don't want to work, they're lazy, right? They don't know what they're doing. You know, because it was interesting when I saw this about the baby boomers responsible for the me generation. I know there was a Time article, I think it was like last year, that it was the me generation. It was talking about the millennials, and there was everybody when saw this that there was a girl on the cover taking a selfie stick picture of herself, right? So each generation has a tendency to kind of judge the younger generation, like you guys don't know what you're doing, you're lazy, you're this, you're that. So it's something that we do kind of historically that trickles down. So I just thought that part of that was interesting. So strengths of the boomers: loyal, hardworking, patient, good mentors, persevering, wise, strong sense of values. And this is just kind of an idea. One thing that of how to care for boomers in the workplace. One thing that's interesting, and I focus this a lot on technology and how much that has changed. Because I know with myself, I was pretty much raised by my grandparents because both my parents were working. So I'm a face-to-face person, and a lot of it has to do with the fact that I'm a therapist too, because 80 to 90% of our communication is what we see on somebody else's face. And this is going, 200,000 years of evolution. That's how we evolved to communicate. So you think about how long cell phones have been around. Does anybody know how long they've been around for?
10 years.
10 years. Yeah, right.
Smartphones.
Smartphones, right? How long have we been texting for? Do you remember when texting first came out? I think it's been like about, what?
It's not about 10
10 years,
years.
right? Right? So what is it about texting? Does anybody have a problem texting? I have a huge problem texting. I mean, I do it, don't get me wrong, because I have 12, 14-year-olds, and that's the only way I can communicate with them. But what do you think's wrong with texting? Right.
You're reading it correctly.
Exactly. Because again, we've got like 200,000 years of evolution and what we see on somebody else's face. And I actually saw, it was funny, somebody had on Facebook, they did a thing where they had Egyptian hieroglyphs. Has anyone seen this? That we finally come full circle, because basically they had the Egyptian hieroglyphs on the top and then they had the emojis on the bottom. Basically, we're not even communicating face to face. We're just sending each other these symbols now, because now actually writing the full word out or writing you out is too much, so we just send it to emoji. Which, the use of emojis can be okay with written text, because that way you can kind of convey that you're happy about something, because you can text somebody something, and if they don't know the tone of voice or see your face, then it's really left up to their interpretation, and you can take the same sentence and interpret it a multitude of different ways. So just something to kind of think of too with different generations. My grandmother's 93 years old, and she's bizarre because she knows how to get on the internet. She's a gamer. She goes on the internet and games, and she also can text and talk on the phone. But she's very unusual. I think most people of that age really want to face-to-face. So while there are always exceptions to the rules, it's just something to kind of keep in mind, especially if you're a younger generation. I know that, the younger generation, especially my son's generation, have cut their teeth on technology. And they're native in that world. People that aren't native really usually prefer talking to your face, because I know from doing this, it causes a lot of problems sometimes in communication. If you've got somebody that's an older generation and the younger generation sending text messages and emails, it starts breaking down communication. So just something to kind of think of. So Generation X, born in a time of declining population growth, Generation Xers possess a strong technical skills and are more independent than prior generations. They're often considered the slacker generation. Again, there's this judgment of going down each generation. Gen Xers naturally question authority figures and are responsible for creating the work-life balance concept. You guys, probably people, the Gen Xers know what that is, the picture up there, right? Right. Actually, funny note, I just saw, is it Judd Nelson? A picture of him the other day, like he disappeared off the face of the earth. I was like, whoa. So it kind of seems like he followed the tradition of this movie and went down that road. A little scary. As Gen Xers place a lower priority on work, many company leaders from the baby boomer generation assume these workers are not as dedicated. Gen Xers are willing to develop their skill sets and take on challenges that are perceived as very adaptive to job instability in a post-downsizing environment. I know that this is, millennials are getting a lot of this press too. I was actually talking to somebody a year ago when I did this presentation that was from HR, and they had been in the field for a while. And they were talking about that they actually had to revamp the way that they were thinking about resumes, because initially, when she first started working, if you had somebody that had job hopped a lot in a resume, it was a bunch of red flags. But she said with the younger generation, they won't stay in something if they're not happy with it, and they will have like a year here, 6 months here, a year here, because they'll hop around until they find what it is they're looking for, and you can no longer look at that with, they're a problematic employee. It's just part of the way that this generation is handling it. So, kind of one thing to think about as well. So some of the strengths of the Gen Xers: flexible, tech-savvy, goal-oriented, socially proactive, politically proactive, flexible, responsible, and adaptable. To really kind of seize the day population. Again, just some ideas on how to communicate and work with a Gen Xer. So you can kind of see the change. It's not face-to-face now, but you can do voicemail or email. That works. They work in that time era. Started to use emails and voicemails. I'm a Gen Xer, and I can remember when we got caller ID for the first time, and then we actually had an answering machine. Like, you could actually come home and find out who called you. I thought that was the coolest thing. And I tell my sons this, and they just kind of look at me like, "What the? What are you talking about?" Recorded voicemails. But just to give you some kind of different ideas and what works. And again, these are generalizations, but what's important: think globally, don't micromanage, provide the latest technology, make it fun, value diversity. Okay, and then talking about the millennials. They're the generation born between 1982 and sometime in the early 2000s, aka Generation Y. Between the ages of 18 and 34, millennials are the most racially diverse generation in U.S. history and embody the changing face of America. They currently outnumber baby boomers by 11 million people. So right now in the workforce, they're the biggest concentration of employees. So again, just to kind of give you a graph on how this is changing. The millennials are the kind of cream-colored piece and how that's expanding. So they are the first global-centric generation, having come of age during the rapid growth of the internet and increasing global terrorism. They're resilient in navigating change while deepening their appreciation for diversity and inclusion, because they're one of the most diverse workforces, right? So they have to embrace diversity. It's a very important part of it. Millennials are also the most educated generation of workers today due to technological advances in educational developments. They represent the most team-centered generation since the silence, as they have grown up at a time where parents program much of their lives with sports, music, and recreational activities to keep them occupied while their boomer parents focused on work. So again, kind of the change, because this generation was raised by both parents working, where some of the silence and older generations had the benefit of having usually mom or primary caretaker at home with them. So focusing on the strengths of millennials: do what you want, basically embrace your passion. Don't stick in a job for, my father-in-law talks about how he worked at the same job for 40 years and he carpooled an hour and a half every day, and that's great, but you just don't really see that happen anymore, that dedication or that staying. So do what you want. Millennials have a tendency to follow their passion. If one job's not working for them, then they'll move on to another, which is kind of like this kind of hopping around that happens. Learning fast, very important, because obviously things are constantly changing, even from a technological standpoint. embracing technology. I know as a mom, this is something I always struggle with my boys, because I feel like these technological advances are happening so fast that psychologically, I know I struggle with keeping up with them. Like, what is the impact of texting? What is the impact of, video games? And, when you finally catch up with that, something else, it seems like, has evolved. So technology seems like it's just going faster and faster. But with that being said, I also know that, my kids are native to this world. I'm an immigrant. I don't think it's going to change. So you do have to embrace it somehow, because it's their future. It's what's going to happen. So being open-minded about the future, taking risks, giving back, live within your means, and live minimally. Does anybody recognize the tiny house up here? I had another cartoon that I was going to put on here. It was actually kind of interesting, because it had the different houses throughout the generations. So you had the Silents that were raising, like, a family of 4 and like a 1,000 square foot house. Kids were sharing bedrooms, and then it kind of went up, and the boomers have like these huge mansions. Well, then it kind of plummets back down to the tiny house, because what's happening for a lot of the millennials? They can't afford it, right? Houses are really expensive, and a lot of them have pretty sizable school loans because the price of education has gone way up. So have houses, but the salary hasn't caught up with that. So the millennial generation is one of the big populations that's pushing the whole tiny house movement and living minimally. Plus, they're also, more environmentally focused on this stuff as well. So I gave you guys all a sheet. I'm going to give you like 5-10 minutes to go over that. So basically what this is you just circle what aligns with you. And the one thing that I do think that's interesting is this is all generalizations. So I'm a Gen Xer, for example, but I was raised by my grandparents. And I know with myself, because of their influence, I have a lot of those silent pieces to me. I tend to be more frugal. I want to save money, and I think about those things as well. But then I also have some millennial traits as well, because I am more technologically savvy, things like that. So it's just to give you guys, time to go over and identify within yourself where you stand. Okay? So I'm going to give you guys like 10 minutes to go ahead and do that. Oh,
there's some more down here.
okay. Did you pass one? Oh, thank you. Oh, okay. Also, you're all set? Okay. You need one? Anybody else need one?
Yeah, I'll bring one up. You know what? I only have one page.
Let's do one page.
Oh, good. I just have one of two. I'll be sure. I'm supposed to talk about it?
Has everybody had the chance to finish? Okay, so what did you guys find? Is everybody like, you know, exactly in the category of what their generation is?
No.
No? Okay. You can kind of think about what life experience, does anybody want to share any life experience they've had that have made things different? Does anybody have any questions about any of the stuff that I went over or want me to go over any further with what we discussed today? Is it all pretty clear?
I did think that the baby boomer generation was more into the mid-60s, and
Yeah.
ended 60. So I was kind of surprised to see that that was what the cutoff was. So
Yeah, I was.
probably different sources say different things.
Right, I was too, but I actually checked several sources when I did it, and that was kind of consistently. There were a couple that there was some variation, but I thought the same thing as well. I thought it was different. But with a lot of the generations too, I thought that the date would be different, but it's farther extended. That's why I was kind of shocked. They were talking about the next generation that's coming in, which is my son's, that they're interning. He's only 14, but it's kind of a broader range than one would think. 'Cause I always thought generation was like kind of like within 10 years, and it really isn't. You know, and it's also too, it's like depending on where you fall, like are you at the beginning of that generation? Because there's a lot of variation just in the beginning, or are you at the tail end of it? Because if you're at the tail end of it, I think there is a lot of, you know, overlapping that happens. Just like I'm a Gen Xer, but I definitely have a lot of the traits of millennials. So it is all these kind of different environmental influences that can happen as well. Sorry, does somebody else have something?
I was going to ask, did you encounter the term Generation Z?
No. What was that?
I think that would probably be your kids.
Oh, yes. Generation Z. Yes, not C. I thought you said C. Yeah, no, Generation Z is the next one coming up. Has anybody encountered any where they can see where this applies in the workplace?
Yeah, I definitely see it. So first, I just want to say, interesting about this self-quiz, I kind of was both in like my parents' generation and Gen X.
Mm-hmm.
So the silence and the Gen X. So whereas I always sort of thought of myself as a baby boomer, but I didn't really answer any of the questions in the column that way. But yeah, I see in the workplace this desire for flexibility that in younger generation, and in my generation, I think it's like, well, what's wrong with these people? You know, right? They know you should just be here, and it's helpful to hear this that it's not that there is something in their generation that feels this is appropriate and is okay and is acceptable. I mean, I think it's very helpful for a manager to think about that, right? They're managing young people. Well, yeah.
Yeah, and the way that I try to set this up too is it was so that you would have awareness of where you fall on this, because I didn't really. And I'm a therapist, and I usually try to think about these things. But when I did this presentation the first time, I didn't really think about that, and then I started looking at like the silence and the, you know, I'm like, I have a lot of these traits, and of course that makes sense because I spent a lot of time with my grandparents growing up. But also, where you fall on that. So you have awareness of what you're bringing to the work environment. But I think the other thing too is and that's why I started off with the icebreaker, so that you guys can come up with ideas and ways to kind of, start having these conversations with people and kind of figuring out what are their work values in a light way, so that way you get to know more about what their values are, and it just makes the workplace work better, I think, and understanding that and kind of looking at this from a different perspective instead of, like I said before, we all have this kind of trait that we always judge the younger generations, and I know I hear a lot about this when there's problems in the workplace, is that, there's older generations that have a certain way of doing things and they want to talk face to face. I know that, again, the technology has been a huge piece to that. And that this younger generation always has their face in the phone and they don't want to communicate face to face. And the older generation has a tendency to take that as a slight, and the younger generation can't understand why they won't catch up with the technology. So you see where this starts creating that problem, because one thing as humans that we all do is we have a tendency to think that our way of viewing the world and perspective is the right way. So it's just kind of opening your mind to, okay, this is younger generation, they grew up in a different environment, they have a different way of doing this. How can we make this work to start the conversation to make it easier? Because everybody has their strengths. Every generation brings their strengths in to the workplace, and it's just trying to figure out how to navigate those. So, good interpersonal relationship skills in the workplace. That's basically what it boils down to. Yeah.
I found with our millennials in our land that they sometimes need to know the expectations. I'm the mother of 2 millennials, and I think I would hurt them if I knew that they did some of the stuff that the people do in our lab. So I think when I sit these younger people down and said these are the expectations, a lot of their behaviors changed.
Yeah.
I mean, you can't have a phone out and playing games with your colleagues by, sometimes I was surprised, and once I told them, it stopped.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that was one of the biggest hurdles, because I knew what my expectations were for my kids. So I was
right. And we noticed it too quite a bit. We've made rules because it seems like, cell phones and technology, if you don't put up good boundaries with it, it seeps into everywhere. I mean, I've had my 2 try to show up at the dinner table by texting where we're eating family dinner, and it will set the limit with it, but every once in a while they'll try again. Mm-hmm. But I do think it's important to have those conversations, because we'll go out and see families that are out at restaurants and they're out together having a family dinner. I'm sure everyone's seen this, and everybody's on their phone. Even the parents, yeah. Exactly. They're out together, but no one's even talking. So it does, and it's kind of society. That's what a lot of people are doing. I mean, I see people, just driving back from my office the other day, guys walking out in traffic, he's texting. So people aren't really aware. So it is, you're kind of pushing against society, but I think that's a very good point, that this is what the expectations are, to kind of have that conversation and make it clear. Because I think kind of what society is doing and, what's actually going on is totally different things.
But also empowering them, because they are an incredibly bright generation. So that, there's a lot we can learn from them. So I certainly didn't want to squash anybody, but the expectations get in out there.
Right. And I think sometimes it's too, working with people's strengths and realizing what the expectations are and having people kind of come together, how can we meet those where everybody's coming from. And it's definitely a great idea too to pull from, the younger generations, because they do have, and so do the older generations, lots of education and lots of experience and different ways of looking at things. Anybody else have anything they wanted to share or talk about? Okay, guys, well, we're finishing a little early, so enjoy your few minutes in between.